this cathedral because you were cold. You guarded it because it was holy. And no one ever stayed long enough to see it was never built to keep them out, but to keep you whole. Carl Jung once described a certain kind of person, not one who merely thinks, but who builds entire inner worlds and sees through the surface of reality. He called them introverted intuitives. These people don't just reflect, they synthesize. They don't just feel, they embody. But their inner architecture is often invisible to others. And what people don't understand, they misname. They call it cold. They call it aloof. Yet Jung reminded us, loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. If you belong to the rare types Jung pointed toward, those deep-seeing introverted intuitives, then you know the pattern. In modern terms, Jung's description often maps to MBTI types like INTJ, INFJ, or INFP, deep intuitives with layered emotional and symbolic cognition. And if that's you, you've probably been called distant, too intense, hard to read. But then, suddenly, it flips. You're too sensitive, too emotional, too reactive. It's the paradox of your type. People either can't feel you at all or they feel too much and blame you for it. But here's the truth they never name. You were never cold, and you were never too emotional. You were guarding something sacred, because your inner world isn't reactive, it isn't impulsive, and it isn't simple. It's not just emotional, and it's not just logical. It's structural, it's symbolic, it's a cathedral. One you built over years, through memory, through wounds, through symbols you couldn't explain out loud. And most people only saw the stone. They never stayed long enough to see the stained glass. In this video, we walk together through the 7 chambers of that cathedral, the sacred psychological structures of the introverted intuitive, built to survive in a world that praises performance and forgets presence. These are not walls. They're sanctuaries, and they were never meant to keep people out, but to keep your soul intact. Let's begin. As we step through the first chamber, a hush settles around us. The light dims, the air stills. This is where it begins. The first chamber is silence. Not absence, but presence misread. It's what Jung described as the fertile ground of introversion, the inward turn towards self when the world feels too shallow. As a child, you weren't hiding, you were observing. You didn't withdraw because you didn't care. You withdrew because you felt everything. This wasn't emotional neglect. It was emotional saturation. And so you found refuge not in people, but in pattern, not in noise, but in nuance. But this stillness was misnamed as distance. And so the world tried to fix you, tried to make you louder, simpler, faster. But stillness was never your dysfunction. It was your compass, and it still is. The second chamber appears suddenly, light glinting off translucent walls. Everything feels exposed, yet sacred. This is the room where vulnerability never left. It simply became invisible. You did open up once. You offered the world your softness, your wonder, your spiritual ache to be met. And they mistook it for fragility. Or worse, they used it. So you protected it, not out of fear, but out of reverence. This chamber isn't a prison. It's preservation. You still feel everything. But now you feel selectively. Because vulnerability without safety isn't intimacy. It's exposure. Jung taught that individuation requires owning the parts of the self that were rejected. And so you built a sanctuary to hold those parts, not to hide them. but to guard their sacredness until someone could meet you without trying to fix, decode, or save you. We descend deeper now. The third chamber opens like a library carved in shadow, lined with symbols, memories, moments. Here lives memory, layered, archived, never lost. This is the room where you stored the conversations that lingered, the facial expressions you never forgot, the patterns that others ignored, but you couldn't unsee. You didn't just remember events, you remembered atmospheres, and those memories became data, then symbols, then systems. This is what Jung meant by the unconscious speaking through image and pattern. You were mapping meaning while others were still reacting. But people called it overthinking. They said, let it go. But you weren't clinging. You were integrating. The archive isn't about obsession. It's about orientation, a sacred cognitive alchemy that turns experience into structure. This is how you survived, and how you learned to see. We ascend. The fourth chamber rises above the others. Windows narrow, perception sharp. You feel it before you see it. This is the room where you stopped being naive, where intuition met betrayal. You saw the lie before it was spoken. You read the tension before it broke. But when you named it, you were told you were imagining things, that you were too suspicious, too serious. But you weren't wrong. You were early. And when intuition is punished, it doesn't vanish. It sharpens. You became hyper-attuned, watching for every inconsistency, scanning for emotional dishonesty, not because you wanted to, but because it became necessary. This is the Jungian shadow, the parts of yourself you had to weaponize to survive the emotional illiteracy of others. The watchtower isn't about paranoia, it's about pattern recognition. And underneath it all, a longing to finally rest, to finally trust. Then the temperature shifts. We cross into the fifth chamber, and the fire greets us, not burning but alive. Here lives the fire. The emotion you were told was too much, the grief too heavy, the anger too sharp. But you didn't suppress it. You refined it. And when no one mirrored your depth, you turned the fire inward. It became shame, then silence. But Jung warned that unlived emotion becomes fate, that what we avoid in ourselves returns as neurosis. So you began to burn again, not destructively, but alchemically. You're not volatile, you're a sacred furnace, transmuting pain into pattern, emotion into empathy. This chamber reminds you, your intensity is not pathology, it's prophecy. Stop apologizing for the fire. You were never meant to be tepid. You were meant to transform. Silence returns. The sixth chamber waits behind an iron door. Heavy, still, but never forgotten. This is the grief vault, the room where your lost versions live. The selves who loved too easily, too early, too much. You locked them away not to forget, but to protect them from a world that called their openness weakness. This is where you stored the one who believed in soft things, who gave without strategy, who stayed too long in places that asked you to shrink. Jung spoke of the necessity to integrate, not reject, the child self, the innocent self, the lover, the dreamer. This room isn't your shame, it's your origin. And when you're ready, you can visit again. You can tell them, you weren't naive, you were sacred. And now, I am strong enough to carry you forward, not bury you. One final turn. The seventh chamber opens not with sound, but with resonance, the kind that lives in bone. This is where your voice lives. Not the mask, not the persona, the real one. The one that broke when you were punished for being too much. The one that faded when praise required performance. This is where the choir hums beneath the silence. Where your soul sings truths you stopped saying out loud. Jung warned us that the persona, while necessary, is not the self. And in this room, you feel the difference. You feel the weight of words unspoken and the power of reclaiming them. This voice doesn't shout. It resonates. It doesn't seek validation. It seeks coherence. You didn't build this cathedral to echo the world. You built it to hear your own soul again. Let yourself speak. So now you've walked the 7 chambers. Silence, vulnerability, memory, vigilance, fire, grief, voice. And through it all, you were never cold. You were never broken. You were never too much. You were misunderstood by a world that fears depth, fears truth, fears feeling. But your cathedral was never for them. It was for you, to survive, to protect, to remember. And now? Now it can become something more. Not a fortress, not a prison, but a home. For your voice, for your presence, for your becoming. As Jung said, the soul becomes great by encompassing opposites. And you, beloved, have done exactly that. Let the world misread your structure, but never again let them name your soul. If this cathedral felt like your own, if you saw yourself in these 7 chambers, if you've been carrying silence, fire, or grief that no one ever named, then don't just scroll away. Before you return to the world, there's one more journey that completes this one. If this video is the cathedral you built to protect your soul, then Burn the House of Trauma room by room is its buried twin. Not a sanctuary, but the ruins beneath it. 10 rooms, 10 fires, the places where pain became pattern and silence began. Watch the companion video next, not to relive your trauma, but to reclaim the parts of you that still live inside its smoke. You'll find the link in the description. Together they form the full map. One builds, one burns. Both heal. Subscribe. Not for content, for return. This channel isn't a brand. It's a sanctuary for the ones who feel too much, think too far, and speak too rarely. Let this be the place where your silence is understood, where your voice is safe, where your depth is never called too much again. You've been guarding the cathedral long enough. Now let it echo.